Welcome back on this week's edition of Inside Eagle Nation, your official podcast for Georgia Southern Athletics, and we are happy to be joined on the third consecutive year by Phil Steele. Does the Phil Steele Preview magazine for college football, does a lot on the NFL side as well, but Phil, appreciate you joining us.
Hey, a real pleasure, Colin. Always enjoy talking Georgia Southern football.
Let's go back to 2020 real quickly. What did the 2020 COVID season, in your eyes, do to the college football world?
Well, I'll be honest with you, Colin. The main thing was that it was played. I think if it hadn't been played, it would have set an ugly precedent. I like the fact that all the college football teams, and even the conferences that said they were going to cancel their seasons, play in the spring, they all ended up coming back playing. We had conference champions in each of the conferences, all 10 of them in the FBS, and then a national champion was crowned at the end of the year. So thank goodness we played. I know it was an uneven season for a lot of teams, the things they had to go through, but almost every team had to go through the same thing. So I'm just very thankful that the season was played.
You talk about some of those leagues that said at the outset that they weren't going to play and then decided to later in the season. At the beginning, it kind of was a little bit of an advantage for a Sun Belt Conference teams that got a lot of national exposure on national TV. From the Sun Belt Conference perspective, what do you think that did to kind of elevate and get it out to more eyes?
Oh, it was definitely huge. And I'll be honest with you. Normally I'm watching 12 games. So I'm watching all the Sun Belt games, but it's one of 12 games that I'm watching. And then what I do during the week is I go and I watch individual games. And I watched more individual games of the Sun Belt this year because I basically could watch all 37 games that were being played each week early in the season. So I know myself learned more about the Sun Belt, and I got to think the nation learned a lot more about it. And then how about the productivity of the Sun Belt teams? I mean, a team like Coastal Carolina proving their worth, having a fantastic season like they did. Louisiana, a great season. App State, even though they slipped a little bit to 9-3, tremendous season. I love the way the Sun Belt played in the bowls. I love the way the Sun Belt played overall. It was just a great season for the Sun Belt.
We've talked about what a typical college football Saturday looks like on your side, whether you're watching 12 games and doing it at all different time slots, but how did the COVID year kind of change what you were able to do this year?
Well, the main difference is, first of all, the things that happened in COVID were the schedule changes. They affected the magazine. We had to put up the updated schedules on the website. People had to print them off, cut them out, put them in their magazine. We had people that had 500-page magazines at the end of the year, Colin. The second thing it did was, last year when I talked to first-year head coaches, generally the first-year head coaches that I talk to every year, at least they've been through a spring practice. Last year I would send them over my team pages, and they've got all the players on the team. They've got all my notes on every player, all the stats on every player. And generally what I do with the coaches, and this year I talked to 110 to 130 head coaches. So I say, okay, coach, put my team in order. Tell me a little something of the strengths and weaknesses on each of the players. Calls take about an hour and a half. With some of the first-year head coaches last year, when I sent them the sheets, they were like, Phil, you probably know the team better than me because I haven't even seen these kids in pads yet. So it was an interesting in that aspect as far as the magazine. So good that we're back to normal this year. Every coach I talked to had the benefit of spring practice already under their belt. And so good that we're going to actually have fans in the stands across the country. I think that's going to be huge this year.
Another thing that makes your job a little bit more difficult in the last year or so has been the transfer portal and having to keep up with all the transfers, who's going where, who is still at what location. And I know you've had to put a couple of asterisks and say this is what it was as of this date. But how much more difficult does the transfer portal and especially late transfers do into what you guys do?
Yeah, and the beautiful thing about it this year, Colin, is last year with COVID, first of all, I didn't know if we were going to print a magazine. Then when I finally decided we were going to print a magazine after talking to the coaches and having them pretty much tell me if you put the ball on the field, we're going to play, we went to the press very late last year. And so this year I determined that we weren't going to go to the press until June 15th. Now, the portal, or the time to enter the portal, closed on June 30th, so we only missed about 15 days, and we were able to capture the majority of the transfers. You take a look at a player like Luke McCaffrey, who was on the Louisville roster in the spring, and then he ended up hitting the portal late May. And I thought, well, we're never going to find Luke McCaffrey. And lo and behold, Mike Bloomgren, the head coach of Rice, calls me on June 13th. Now, we're in the final 2 days of the magazine trying to get everything together. And he's like, Phil, you told me to call you if we got anybody. We got Luke McCaffrey coming in because of the fact that he had the relationship with the family at Stanford. So now we were able to plug Luke McCaffrey in as a starting quarterback at Rice, change the quarterback write-up, change the offensive write-up, change the overall forecast, and get that updated. So we were able to capture the majority of it, but it did make it difficult. I'll tell you what, though, it makes it a lot more difficult on the coaches, Colin, because they've got to almost re-recruit their entire roster every year to keep them on the team from not hitting the portal. It's really tough on the coaches.
So we dive into what the 2021 season looks like. Give us your overall kind of what it looks like from a 100,000-foot view of the Sun Belt Conference. We're going to talk a little bit more specific of the East and the West, but kind of the overall arching views of what the Sun Belt looks like in 2021.
Well, the big news is for the Sun Belt is in the front of the magazine, I ranked the conferences, and generally the Sun Belt is always down there, let's face it, 8, 9, or 10. As far as the conferences go. But this year, I actually rated the Sun Belt as the seventh best conference in college football, right behind the American Conference. And it's the strength at the top. You take a look at teams like App State, Coastal Carolina, Louisiana. All three of those teams are capable of having the same type of success that the Sun Belt had last year, running the table perhaps, and being ranked. And so that's a big plus. I look at the West, my overall view, it's Louisiana and a bunch of guys. When I look at the East, I'm looking at 5 bowl-caliber teams. I mean, App State, Coastal, Georgia State, Troy, Georgia Southern, all 5 of them are bowl-caliber teams. I think the East is going to be an extremely tough division this year.
And you kind of had that in your magazine. You had Appalachian State and Coastal as number 1s in the East whenever you ranked them, and then Georgia State, Troy, Georgia Southern, all as 3s. What kind of went into that? It's kind of something unique in the magazine as far as that's the way that you ranked the Sun Belt East.
Yeah, when you go back and look at it, Colin, there are generally a lot of ties in the standings. So I do probably put more ties than most folks do, but let's face it, I think there's about 40% of the teams end up being tied in the division standings on the course of a year. But for me, it was like splitting hairs trying to figure out who I would pick for that. Georgia State is a much improved team this year. They were great down the stretch. Georgia Southern is loaded, 16 returning starters, 16-3 at home the last 3 years. And they, of course, have got last year they had 4 close losses or could have had a much better record. And Troy's a team that, last year was very inexperienced, got hit hard by COVID. But I think they're a very talented team, and they've proven that on the field on a weekly basis. I couldn't pick one of those teams to finish 3rd and then one of those teams to finish 5th. So I picked them all as a tie for 3rd. I think they're all bowl-caliber squads.
When you look at Georgia Southern specifically, you talk about the record at Paulson Stadium at home, and we've talked about it in past editions of Inside Eagle Nation. This may be the best home schedule that Georgia Southern has. You've got Louisiana, Arkansas State, Coastal Carolina, and BYU all coming to Statesboro. What does that do for a Georgia Southern team that historically has done well at home, but I know in your magazine you said it's one of those either make or break type deals?
Yeah, and that's it completely. It is a make-or-break season for Georgia Southern based on those home games because, those are the 3 top teams in the league, and if you end up losing those games, then all of a sudden the more winnable games are all on the road, making for a very tough environment. But, you go back and look at Louisiana last year. Georgia Southern probably should have beat them on the road, and they came up 2 points short. Now they get them at home, so that could be a huge feather in their cap early in the season. The Coastal Carolina game last year wasn't great, but the last time Coastal traveled here was an overtime game, went to 3 overtimes. Georgia Southern won. If they can get that win again, that would be huge. And even a team like BYU at home is going to be a big game. So, and Georgia State at home is another one. So, I mean, the home games are huge. If Georgia Southern wins all their home games this year, they've got a chance of winning the Sun Belt. If they lose those home games against the top teams, then it could make for a difficult season.
When you look at the personnel for Georgia Southern, what they have this year, you mentioned 16 returning starters for this Eagles team. What is it that you see from this Georgia Southern team? Obviously having to figure out the quarterback position with Shy Words moving to Louisville, but what is it about this Georgia Southern team that you see that really jumps out to you?
I think when you look offensively, it's the backfield, and if they can get Justin Tomlin back, I know he's going to miss the first 2 games, but Justin Tomlin, I think, can be a very good quarterback in this system. Working with a guy like J.D. King, and then the addition of Amari Jones. I think Amari Jones is a guy that's just going to be a dynamic playmaker coming over from Tulane. They're going to use him as running back, receiver, probably wildcat quarterback as well. That really sets up well for the offense of Georgia Southern and makes them a lot more dynamic, having a player like him on the field. Defensively, last year they only gave up 326 yards per game. They played pretty good defense. My biggest question is who's going to replace Raymond Johnson. I mean, he was a very productive defensive end. He was a guy that had 5 sacks, 9.5 TFL last year. They also lose Rashad Bird, but I like the overall talent, and I like the additions at linebacker. Despite losing the top linebackers, they add in a Kadri Jackson and Andrew Johnson, transfers from North Carolina and Oregon, which helps out. And it's a veteran secondary. 2 NFL-caliber cornerbacks in Darrell Baker and Derek Canteen, I think, really help out a defense all the way around. So this is a very talented Georgia Southern team. Offensively, the player that I think is going to jump out at the end of the year is going to be Amari Jones.
And you talk about Amari Jones. I know he's somebody that you're extremely high on. You mentioned the transfer from Tulane. You ranked him as the 4th-team running back in the preseason poll when he hasn't taken a snap as a Sun Belt Conference player. What goes into that, and what do you see translating from the Tulane to Georgia Southern systems?
Yeah, well, I mean, he's a guy who I know what he can do, and he's very versatile. I don't know if he's necessarily going to be the feature running back this year behind J.D. King. That's why we've got him 4th team, but he's just a natural football player. He's a guy that can play running back, receiver, return kicks, return punts, play wildcat quarterback. And what I saw from him when he was at Tulane was just an explosive playmaker. And I think he's going to translate well into the offense. Talked to Coach Lunsford, going over the team with him post-spring this year. He feels he's going to have a huge year. So a lot of that went into putting him onto the all-conference team.
Dive into some of the non-conference opponents for Georgia Southern this year, and it starts with Game 2 and FAU. What do you see from this FAU team, a team that Georgia Southern saw last year here at Paulson Stadium after getting a little bit of a scheduling snafu, but what do you see from this FAU team this year?
Well, FAU is one of those teams where Coach Taggart was a first-year head coach last year, didn't have the benefit of spring practice, and frankly surprised me a little bit with how they came out. I mean, Florida Atlantic ended up starting out the season 5-1, and then got hit hard by COVID down the stretch. But I like what I saw out of their defense. Last year, their defense gave up just 342 yards per game. And then even in the Georgia Southern game, a game they lost 20-3, they held Georgia Southern just 339 total yards offense. They've got 10 starters back on the defensive side of the ball. Offensively, they've got 10 starters back. And the biggest question mark is going to be quarterback, but they've got 2 guys coming in, a transfer from Miami and N'Kosi Perry, transfer from Penn State, Michael Johnson. Those are big-time pluses. They had in a transfer from South Florida, running back, and Johnny Ford, another dynamic running back, much like Amari Jones that we talked about. They had in from on the offensive line an Auburn transfer in Kamir Bell, a Florida State transfer in Andrew Baselli. So they did attack the transfer portal on the offensive side of the ball, where I think they will be improved. And defensively, they already had one of the best defenses in CUSA. So that's going to be a tough game for Georgia Southern. Plus, Florida Atlantic gained familiarity with the option last year, having faced it, and now they get that at home, second week of the season, so they actually get extra time in the fall to prepare for it.
The following week, Georgia Southern will head out to Fayetteville, and this is an Arkansas team that I know people out in Fayetteville are getting more and more excited for Razorback football and what they could be in 2021. Yeah,
and we talked about the depth of the the Sun Belt division that Georgia Southern is playing in this year, the East. Well, they're taking on the SEC West, and while I picked Arkansas 7th in the West, this is another one of those divisions that's got 7 bowl caliber teams. And Sam Pittman just did a remarkable job last year with Arkansas. I mean, they were a team that hadn't won an SEC game in years, a couple of years. Came into the season with no spring practice. They only had 13 returning starters last year, and they were actually an underdog in all 10 games. But they went 3-7, and not only 3-7, pulling upsets of Mississippi State, Mississippi, Tennessee. You could argue they beat Auburn. There was a backward pass in that game that should have been ruled a fumble. Arkansas should have beaten Auburn, but the refs said it was an incomplete pass or intentional grounding and gave the ball back to Auburn. Auburn got a late second field goal to beat them. You look at the LSU game where they were depleted on the defensive line, yet only lost by 3. Missouri kicked a field goal on the final play of the game to beat them. They could easily have been a 6-4 team last year, despite being in the first year. Now they've got 19 returning starters coming back. Biggest question mark is quarterback. They lose their quarterback Felipe Franks, but they do return KJ Jefferson and Malik Hornsby. I like both those guys. They're solid. They've got one of the best wide receivers in the country in Treylon Burks, one of the best tight ends in the country in Hudson Henry, a top-notch offensive line. And defensively, they've got a linebacker in Grant Morgan and a safety in Jalen Catalon that are among the best players in the country. So this is a very dangerous Arkansas team, and that's going to be another big-time test for Georgia Southern. Who made the schedule for Georgia Southern, by the way?
I think that would be the athletic director, but it'll be interesting to see how it plays out. But the final non-conference game that Georgia Southern will have is BYU. Again, that's a home game, second to last weekend of the regular season. The first time Georgia Southern is going to see BYU that really jumped on the national stage in the last year or so. What do you see from this BYU team?
Well, it was really interesting, Colin. Last year when I was talking to Coach Sataki, and we finally get done with our hour and a half phone call and going over every player on the team, we both were in complete agreement that in his 5th year, it was by far the best team he had put on the field. And just as I was about ready to hang up, he goes, we don't play the schedule we used to play. And I thought about that, and he was absolutely right. And then it proved completely right during the season when BYU's schedule got crumpled up, thrown out the window. I believe 8 Power 5 teams off the schedule. Now they played a more manageable schedule and probably should have been unbeaten last year. They got that Coastal Carolina game scheduled 2 days in advance. Coastal Carolina runs a very tough option to prepare for, even if you had a month to prepare for it. They had to play it in 2 weeks, and their wide receiver got tackled at the 1-yard line at the end of the game, or they still would have beaten Coastal in an outstanding 11-1 season. Now, my initial reaction with BYU was that they're going to be nowhere near last year, a much tougher schedule. They lose 7 starters on the defensive side of the ball. They lose their quarterback, Zach Wilson, who's going to start for the Jets this year. You figure there's going to be a big step back. But going through the team with Coach Sataki, he likes the defensive line. Even though they're young, they've got no returning starters up front. He says he's got complete confidence in them, feels they go 3 deep on the D-line. The linebackers are solid this year. And when you look at the backfield, Tyler Algier and Lapina Katoa are a couple of guys at NFL prospects at the running back position. They're going to be good, not quite as good as last year's team. And that's going to be a real interesting game when those two play. BYU gives a benefit of a bye the week before Georgia Southern, which always helps when you're playing an option team. But Georgia Southern hopefully will take advantage of that home field edge.
Going through these conversations like we have the last 3 years, it amazes me how you are able to recall specific plays from a game that you have seen, obviously, but being able to recall a play from a year ago or whatever. Where did that memory come from for you?
Well, it is a pure football memory, I'll tell you that much, Colin. I couldn't tell you anything about anything else that goes on. In fact, people think I'm clueless in other aspects of life, but I've just fully focused everything of my attention into college football, and that's where my strength is. Other than that, like I said, other parts, I don't even notice things if it's not football.
From the overall perspective, what does 2021 on the college football world kind of look like, and who are some of the standouts that you kind of keep your eye on this year?
Well, I tell you what, the overall college football, I can't tell you how excited I am, Colin, genuinely about this season. Last year, after not knowing if we're going to play, not knowing the schedules, having games get canceled, no fans in the stands, and now this year we're back to normal. I got to think that we're going to probably have the best home field edges across the country because fans got deprived of going to the games last year. They're going to come back, be super loud, be excited to be there. I think we're going to have the best home field edges maybe ever in college football, 1 year after having almost no home field edges last year due to COVID. As far as some of the key players this year goes, I think when you take a look at the Heisman race, naturally I've got Spencer Rattler there right at the top. I think Oklahoma will have the number one offense in the country this year again, and like they normally do when Lincoln Riley has got a veteran quarterback to work with. They have my number one rated offensive line, number two set of receivers, number four set of running backs. They're going to be explosive. They also bring a defense this year. A couple other players. How about Sam Howell in North Carolina? I think he's going to he loses his top two running backs and his top two receivers. At the end of the year, you're going to have two new names at that receiver spot that put up the same type of stats that they did last year. I think Sam Howell's going to have a heck of a year. Matt Corral, quarterback at Ole Miss, going to put up big-time stats in that Lane Kiffin offense. And then three new names on the scene. DJ Uiagalelei of Clemson, Bryce Young of Alabama, C.J. Stroud of Ohio State. All will be starting quarterbacks for the first time for those three powerhouse teams. And at the end of the year, it wouldn't surprise me if those three players were all Heisman finalists or close to being a Heisman finalist. As far as the Sun Belt goes, you got to like the fact that Grayson McCall is back this year. I think he's an outstanding quarterback, runs that offense extremely well. As mentioned, I'm really looking forward to seeing Amari Jones come in this year for Georgia Southern. I think he's going to be a big-time impact player there. And also, you look at a guy like Jalen Tolbert of South Alabama. I like what I saw to him last season. I think he's going to have a big year, a wide receiver. And then how about the Coastal Carolina combination? It's highly likely that Javon Hiley and Isaiah Likely will be an impact duo for Coastal this season again.
It's going to be a great 2021 season to be able to watch. Going to be great to have everybody back in the stands, as you mentioned. Phil, really appreciate the time and looking forward to 2021.
Yeah, it should be a fun year. And, Colin, I think you're going to have a fun year announcing the Georgia Southern games. Let's get those home wins and do something big this year.
Sounds like a plan. Thanks, Phil.